Hey you, and welcome to my channel. My name is Tina and my aim is to improve your drawings just like others have done for me when I just started out. In today's video I want to give you 5 more tips on how to create realism in your drawings. If you want more tips, check out the video I made earlier which has 5 more tips. Now, tip number 1, subscribe to this channel. Just kidding, although you could definitely benefit from it. Let me get started for real now with the first tip. Learn to work very lightly. Whatever it is that you like to draw realistically, you will need several layers. For instance, if you look at animal fur, you could try and just recreate what you see and try to get the top layer down. The problem is that this won't look natural. Fur in real life is actually made up of different layers stacked on top of each other. Trying to only get the top layer in won't have any natural look to it. So just like real life fur, you will also have to work in layers. Now, depending on your subject, your paper and your art supplies, this will be easier or harder to achieve. For example, you can create your underlayer with soft pastel sticks, but they disperse more pigment, which in turn clogs up the paper faster, which in turn makes adding more layers harder. Another example could be using an ingress paper. In my experience, they tend to take less pigment than a sanded paper like pastel matte. But there is one thing that will benefit your drawings no matter what, and that is to work lightly. In the beginning I had some difficulties with this myself, since I like to press my materials down a little bit too much on the hard side. I think it was so because the way that I learned to color as a kid, I had to unlearn this behavior. You could try some exercises related to this, like trying to see how many layers you can get on a piece of scrap pastel paper, and then try again and break your previous record. But for the most part, if you are already conscious on the fact that you need to work lightly, this will show in your work. The second tip is how to build your underlayer. I've been asked a few times how to start with your first layer, since it can be daunting to know what to include and what not. To start with, you need to overlook all the details. All you need right now are good values to start with. I'll explain in general first and then I will show you an example. So I will have a good look at my reference picture and I try to decide what the color is in each section. If you have issues with this, a color picker is a great help. Throughout these sections you will see some variation in this. I'm referring to the highlights and shadows. You don't need to get in all of this. The trick is to find a value or color that is darker than the highlights and lighter than the shadows. This way, when you start working on these highlights and shadows later, whichever one you are working on, they will stand out from your underlayer. If you were to go for the color you see in the top layer immediately, you can't get any of the details in because they won't stand out. This way you have no chance of creating any texture or depth. So you want to go for a mid-tone color, and if you aren't sure, I would always prefer it to be a little bit too dark rather than too light. So this is an example of what I mean. The first color that is selected here is a little bit too light, because that's the highlight in this area. And the second one is a little bit too dark because that's the color of the shadows in that area. And the third one is the one we are looking for, the mid-tone. Right between those two, but a little bit more to the darker side. That's the perfect color for our underlayer, and our highlights and shadows will still stand out. The third tip is that you don't need to be afraid of using reference pictures. Reference pictures allow us to observe what a subject really looks like and work with this. Not using reference results in you working from what you think it looks like. Now, the beauty of reference pictures is that they provide us with details and all of the complexities that you otherwise wouldn't think about. And when trying to achieve a realistic piece, it's all about those small details. So don't be bullied or pressured into thinking that working from a reference picture makes you a cheater. It doesn't. It's simply a tool just like any others that we have to our disposal, so you should use it. Tip number 4, which follows the previous tip, it's all about the reference pictures themselves. When it comes to picking your reference pictures, you do need to be a bit picky. For starters, you want a picture that has a great resolution. This way you are able to zoom in to your desire. And secondly, and this has nothing to do with the quality of the picture itself rather than its composition. When you are looking for pictures, it's always a good idea to search for pictures that have dynamic play between light and shadows. This is a little bit tricky because you don't want to end up with a picture that is either over or underexposed. One of the reasons why this is so important is because by having this interesting dynamic going on in your reference picture, you'll also have an easier time to to get that interesting dynamic in your piece. Now let's talk about a few examples of how a great reference picture looks like and what you need to be careful for when looking for one. So the first one is this great lion picture. This is a good example of what it should be, because you have the shadows on the one side and the highlights on the other side. Yet none of them are too dominant for the mid-tones to be washed out. So this would be a great reference picture for me. Then the second one is a lion that is a little bit underexposed in my opinion, because you don't have much highlights, there are a lot of shadows, and you can't see much details because of the highlights and shadows that are missing. Then we go over to an elephant picture that I've already made a tutorial on, by the way, and that's because I really like this picture. It has a lot of nice shadows around the ear, underneath the trunk, but it still has a lot of highlights, yet not too exposed highlights, so it has a very natural and calm feel to it, which I really like in this one. Then the second elephant picture is just a little bit underexposed, so not an interesting dynamic between light and shadows. The fifth tip, keep in mind that in realism there are no visible lines. In real life, the shapes we see are created by subtle differences in values, and this in turn influenced by light and shadow. That being said, you want to stay clear from creating any kind of lines that outline the shape like you would do if you were drawing in a cartoony style. Now, when it comes to lines that you sometimes do need to use, imagine drawing fur for example, as long as you make sure you variate the length, thickness and curve, you will stay clear from any unrealistic looking piece. Now, none of these tips will change your artworks dramatically, but if you keep these in mind and practice them, they sure can improve your artworks, and at the end, that is what you are looking for. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it, and more importantly, that you learned something. If you want to keep watching some of my content, you can just click the screen on my left side, and if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do so now. I really appreciate it, as it helps to grow my channel, and this means a lot to me. With that being said, I hope you have a great week, and I hope to see you again next Friday.